When Diane walked into my office, I expected to see a woman celebrating survival. She had beaten cancer. Stage 2 breast cancer, caught early, treated aggressively, now in remission. That should be a victory. That should mean relief, gratitude, maybe even joy. But the woman sitting across from me carried none of that. Her shoulders curved inward like she was trying to make herself smaller, as if her body was apologizing for taking up space in the world. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlocked so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. There was a tremor there. Not the tremor of illness, but something else. Something I had seen before in survivors of a different kind of violence. She didn't look at me for the first 5 minutes. Her eyes stayed fixed on the corner of my desk, on a spot where the wood grain made a small dark knot. I watched the micro movements of her face, the slight twitch at the corner of her mouth, the way she kept swallowing as if words were forming and dying in her throat before they could escape. I let the silence breathe. 22 years in this profession had taught me that some patients need to find their own rhythm, and pushing too soon only drives them deeper into the walls they've built. When she finally spoke, her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The sound seemed to cost her something. I thought he was saving me. A breath caught in her throat. Her fingers tightened against each other. I thought he loved me. Her hands came up slowly, covering her face. Through her fingers, muffled and broken. But he was killing me, and I was paying him to do it. I had been a psychologist for 22 years. I had sat across from survivors of abuse, witnesses to tragedy, people who had lost everything and somehow kept breathing. I thought I had heard every variation of human suffering, but something in Diane's words, that specific combination of shame, love, and financial ruin wrapped around the word killing, told me I was about to hear something different. Who was he? And why would a cancer patient pay someone who was killing her? Her breathing had shifted, shallow now, catching in her chest. Her body knew what her mind was preparing to release, and it was bracing for impact. I didn't know yet that Diane's story would become one of the most systematic cases of exploitation I had ever encountered. A man who hunted dying women. A system designed to drain hope and money in equal measure, and a web of manipulation so complete that even now, months after escaping it, Diane couldn't fully separate the abuse from what she had believed was love. Some sessions my patients heal as they speak, but some stories, they stay with me, they don't leave. Today, I'm going to share one of those lives with you. If you're listening to this story and there are things inside you that you can't hold anymore, share what you're going through in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from. I read every comment, I hear every story. If you want to stay updated on the therapy stories I can't get out of my head, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If this story touches your feelings, you can support me by hitting the like button. One day, I'd love to hear your story too. If you want me to share your story in my next video, you can send it to the email address in my profile. Remember, our stories heal a little when we share them. Before I tell you what happened in that room, I need you to understand something about Diane. Not just who she was when she walked through my door, but who she had been before everything fractured. She was 51 years old, a high school literature teacher for 23 years, the kind of teacher students remembered decades later because she made Shakespeare feel alive and poetry feel necessary. Her students sent her wedding invitations, birth announcements, graduation photos. She kept them all in a box in her closet. She had a gift for language, for seeing beneath the surface of words. She could read a student's essay and know they were struggling at home before they said a word. She noticed things, but when it came to her own life, that perception failed her completely. There was something about the way Diane described her teaching career that caught my attention. She used past tense exclusively. Not I teach, but I taught. Not my students, but the students I used to have. She had already buried that version of herself. The question was, what had killed it? I noted the dissociation in her language, the psychological distance she was creating between her present self and her past identity. This is common in trauma survivors. The person they were before feels like a stranger, someone naive and foolish who deserved what happened to them. It's a protective mechanism. but also a prison. 8 years before she walked into my office, her husband Robert died of a sudden heart attack. No warning, no goodbye. Just a phone call at 3 a.m. and a world that cracked in half. They had been married for 19 years. No children, not by choice, but by circumstance. Failed treatments, miscarriages that left scars both visible and invisible, and eventually an acceptance that became its own kind of grief. Robert's death didn't just take her husband, it took her witness, the only person who knew the full story of her life. Diane was alone in a way that most people never experience. She coped the way many people do, by burying herself in work, grading papers until midnight, volunteering for every committee, filling every silence with activity so she wouldn't have to hear the emptiness echo back at her. I became very good at being busy, she told me, and something flickered across her face. The ghost of recognition. I didn't realize until much later that busy and alive are not the same thing. I made a note. This kind of insight, the ability to look back and see patterns, suggested that Diane's recovery, while painful, had already begun before she entered my office. Something had cracked her open enough to start seeing clearly. I suspected that something was the very betrayal she was about to describe. And then 2 years ago, her body betrayed her in a different way. A lump, a mammogram, a biopsy, and finally the words no one ever wants to hear. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Patterson, it's cancer. Stage 2 breast cancer. Contained. Treatable." Her oncologist was cautiously optimistic. With chemotherapy and surgery, her survival rate was over 85%. Those were good odds, those were hopeful odds. But as I observed Diane's face while she recounted this diagnosis, her expression didn't match the statistics. There was no relief in her memory of that 85%, only terror. "What did you hear when he told you?" I asked. Not what did he say, but what did you hear? Because trauma doesn't listen to words. It listens to echoes. She was quiet for a long moment. "I heard my husband dying alone in a hospital bed because I was asleep and didn't answer the phone. I heard my mother spending her last six months vomiting from chemo. I heard every story I'd ever heard about cancer, and none of them ended with hope." I understood something crucial then. Diane's response to cancer wasn't just about cancer. It was about accumulated loss. Every grief she had experienced was now filtering through this new diagnosis, amplifying it, distorting it into something monstrous. This is how trauma compounds. One wound doesn't heal before the next arrives, and eventually the body stops distinguishing between them. Her fear of chemotherapy wasn't irrational. It was her mother's death wearing a new mask. Her fear of dying alone wasn't paranoid. It was Robert's empty hospital bed replaying in her mind. When someone is this wounded, they become vulnerable to anyone who offers an alternative narrative, anyone who says, "What if you didn't have to go through what you fear most?" That's when he found her, not by accident, not by coincidence, by design. His name was Gabriel, and he had been looking for someone exactly like Diane. Gabriel was 55 years old. Silver hair, worn slightly too long, and of gested artistry rather than neglect. A calm voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat, something he had clearly practiced. And eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you, as if he could see something in your soul that you couldn't see yourself. He called himself a holistic healing practitioner. He ran what he called a wellness center, a beautiful building with bamboo floors and soft lighting and the smell of essential oils in every room. The kind of place that looked like healing, that smelled like healing, that felt safe in ways hospitals never do. He found Diane through a YouTube video she had watched in the middle of one sleepless night, 2 days after her diagnosis. A testimonial from a woman who claimed she had cured her stage 3 cancer through natural methods. The woman looked healthy, radiant, alive. She spoke directly to the camera with the calm certainty of someone who had seen the other side and returned. She said she had rejected chemotherapy, poison, she called it, and chosen Gabriel instead. Diane watched that video 4 times, at 2 a.m., at 3 a.m., at 4:30 a.m. when the sky was starting to lighten and she still hadn't slept. The woman's face became a kind of talisman. If she could do it, maybe I can too. In the comments, someone had posted his website. Diane didn't reach out to him. She didn't have to. 3 days later, she received an email, personalized, warm, as if he already knew her, as if he had been waiting for her. Dear Diane, it read, I understand you're going through something difficult. Many women in your situation feel abandoned by a medical system that treats them like a number. I've helped women like you before. There's another way. If you're ready to explore it, I'm here. How did he know? How did he find her email? Her name, her diagnosis? I asked Diane this, and she couldn't explain it. Perhaps a data broker, perhaps a wellness newsletter she had once subscribed to, perhaps something more sinister, a network that shared information about vulnerable cancer patients. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he appeared at the exact moment when Diane was most willing to believe in miracles, when her defenses were lowest, when her judgment was clouded by terror. Something in Diane's body language had changed as she described Gabriel's email. Her posture shifted. She was leaning slightly forward now. Her voice had lost some of its tremor. This is a phenomenon I've observed before. When trauma survivors describe their abusers, their bodies sometimes mirror the state they were in during the initial seduction. The manipulation had created neural pathways that still activated when she thought about those early moments. Gabriel hadn't just taken her money, he had rewired something in her brain. What made you respond? I asked carefully. I needed to understand the hook, the specific vulnerability he'd exploited to bypass her defenses. Diane's eyes finally met mine. He saw me, or I thought he did. My oncologist gave me 15 minutes, Gabriel gave me 2 hours. He asked questions about Robert, about my childhood, about my dreams. Her words trailed off. A moment of stillness. Do you know how long it had been since anyone asked me about my dreams? She went to his center, just to see. She wasn't going to do anything drastic. Just explore options. Keep an open mind. That's what she told herself. Gabriel was everything her fear needed him to be. He didn't rush, he didn't push. He listened for the entire first session, 2 hours of undivided attention. He asked about her marriage, her grief, her loneliness, her fear of hospitals. He held her hand when she cried. He said things like, I understand and you're not alone and your feelings are valid. He was performing empathy. I recognize the technique, it's called mirroring, and it's devastatingly effective. He was reflecting back exactly what Diane needed to see, a kind, wise figure who genuinely cared about her well-being. Something shifted in Diane as she described this first meeting. Her voice changed, it softened. Her shoulders dropped slightly. Even now, after everything, some part of her remembered that touch as comfort. This is the cruelest aspect of calculated manipulation. The tenderness feels real in the moment. The brain doesn't distinguish between genuine care and performed care. It only registers the warmth, the attention, the relief of being seen. These memories become tangled with the trauma, making it nearly impossible to hate the abuser completely. And Gabriel knew this. He was counting on it. He told me I was special, Diane said quietly, that he rarely took personal interest in patients, but there was something about me, something he wanted to protect. She looked at me for the first time since she began speaking. Her eyes were searching for something. Judgment, perhaps, or understanding, or permission to feel what she was feeling. I hadn't felt special to anyone in 8 years. 8 years of being invisible, of walking through rooms where no one turned to look, of sleeping alone in a bed that still had his pillow on the other side. Her voice cracked. Do you know what that does to a person? To be unseen for so long that when someone finally sees you, you'll believe anything they say? I did know. I had seen it many times. Loneliness is not merely an emotion, it's a state of psychological vulnerability that predators specifically target. It creates a hunger that can override all rational thought, all education, all experience. Diane wasn't stupid. She was starving. Gabriel's method was elegant in its cruelty. I would later recognize it as a textbook case of coercive control executed with surgical precision. But Diane didn't see the architecture of her own manipulation. She only felt saved. First, he isolated her, not directly. He never said, stop talking to your friends or your family doesn't understand. That would have been too obvious, too controlling. Diane was an educated woman. She would have recognized overt manipulation. Instead, Gabriel used a subtler approach. Most people won't understand your healing journey, he said, his voice gentle, almost sad, as if he wished the world were different. They're still trapped in conventional thinking. They've been programmed to believe that doctors are the only answer, that chemotherapy is the only way. When you tell them what you're choosing, they'll be afraid. They'll try to scare you back into the system because they don't know any better. It's not their fault, but you need to protect yourself. You need to surround yourself with positive energy if you want your body to heal. He framed isolation as self-care, as boundary setting, as strength. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Diane found herself pulling away. Colleagues at school asked about her treatment and she gave vague answers. I'm exploring all my options. The few friends she had maintained after Robert's death stopped calling because she stopped calling them back. When her sister expressed concern about the wellness center she had mentioned, Diane felt a flash of irritation. Why can't she just support me? And realized later that this irritation had been planted by Gabriel. He had taught her to interpret love as interference. Gabriel became her primary source of connection. Her world narrowed to the walls of his wellness center, the sound of his voice, the smell of his essential oils. He was the first person she thought about when she woke up, and the last person she thought about before she fell asleep. Her entire emotional life had become organized around him. This is the architecture of coercive control, not a single dramatic break but a gradual rewiring, a slow erosion of every connection until the victim stands alone in a world of one. Second, he established financial dependency, a gradual bleeding that Diane didn't recognize as bleeding until the wound was too deep to close. His treatments were expensive, $3,000 a month, for customized herbal blends, capsules that, when later tested by a laboratory at the request of one of the other victims, contained nothing but common vitamins, turmeric, black pepper extract, and cellulose filler. $500 per energy clearing session where he would wave his hands over her body and speak in low, soothing tones, sometimes for 90 minutes, sometimes for 2 hours. The sessions had no set length, no clear protocol. They ended when Gabriel decided they should end, which kept Diane in a constant state of uncertainty and dependence. Then came the bigger asks. A $15,000 intensive detox retreat at a cabin he owned upstate. A $10,000 advanced healing module that required purchasing special equipment. A vibrating mat, crystals arranged in specific patterns, a light therapy device that hummed at frequencies he claimed aligned with cellular regeneration. None of it worked. All of it cost money. The body cannot heal in a state of financial anxiety, he told her. You must invest in yourself completely. Holding back money is holding back your life force. This is what Robert would have wanted. For you to fight for your life with everything you have. He invoked her dead husband's name. He used her grief as a lever to pry open her wallet. He made spending money on his treatments feel like an act of love, of loyalty, of self-respect. Diane had inherited $120,000 from Robert's life insurance. It was a safety net, a future, a modest cushion that would have seen her through retirement, that would have meant she never had to worry about whether she could afford her medications or her groceries in her final years. In 14 months, every dollar was gone. Every single one. Diane's hands betrayed her as she recounted the financial details. Her fingers had started moving, rubbing together in a repetitive, self-soothing gesture. The shame of losing the money was still fresh, still raw. It wasn't just money she had lost, it was proof, she believed, of her own foolishness. I want to name something, I said carefully. What you're describing isn't gullibility. It's a systematic exploitation designed by someone who understood exactly how to manipulate people in crisis. Gabriel didn't succeed because you were stupid. He succeeded because he was practiced. Because he had done this before. Because his entire system was built to bypass the critical thinking of intelligent people like you. Diane's jaw tightened. I could see she wanted to believe me, but the shame was a wall. There were vitamins in those capsules, she said flatly. Vitamins and turmeric. I was paying $3,000 a month for something I could have bought at a grocery store for $20. Third, and this is where I saw Diane's breathing change, becoming shallow and rapid, he convinced her to stop chemotherapy. The doctors want to poison you, he said. Their chemicals will destroy your immune system. Your body knows how to heal itself if you give it the right environment. You just need to trust the process. Trust me. He used her mother's death as ammunition. Your mother did chemotherapy, didn't she? And what happened to her? Diane's mother had died of cancer. The chemo hadn't saved her. Gabriel turned that grief into evidence for his lies. She missed her first chemotherapy appointment, then her second. Her oncologist called, concerned. Gabriel told her not to answer. They'll try to scare you back into their system. That's how they make money, by keeping you sick. I needed to pause here. The clinical reality of what Diane was describing was devastating. She had a treatable cancer, an 85% survival rate. And she had walked away from that treatment because a man with herbal capsules and soft lighting told her she should. How long did you follow his protocol instead of your oncologist's? I asked. Diane's voice dropped. 14 months. 14 months. I kept my expression neutral, but internally I was calculating the damage. Stage 2 breast cancer, left untreated for over a year. The progression would have been significant. When did you realize something was wrong? She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. I started coughing blood. Gabriel said it was a good sign. He said the toxins were leaving my body. She looked at me with something close to disbelief, and I believed him. I believed blood coming out of my lungs was healing. This is what psychological manipulation does. It doesn't just change what you believe, it changes how you think. It creates a closed loop where every piece of evidence, even evidence of harm, gets reinterpreted to support the manipulator's narrative. Diane was an educated woman, a teacher who had spent her career training young minds to question and analyze, and yet, in the hands of a skilled predator, her critical thinking had been systematically dismantled. Gabriel had used a technique I recognized from cult psychology, thought-terminating cliches. Whenever doubt arose, he had a ready phrase: the body knows how to heal. Trust the process. Negative thoughts block healing energy. The universe is testing you. These phrases weren't arguments, they were walls. They stopped inquiry before it could begin. They made questioning feel like failure, like weakness, like the reason the treatment wasn't working. There was another layer to Gabriel's manipulation, one that Diane found almost impossible to discuss. She started to tell me about it and stopped. Her hand went to her throat, pressing against her collarbone as if trying to hold something in. She looked at the window, then the floor, then back at me. She was deciding something. I need to tell you something, she said. Her voice had dropped even lower, almost inaudible. But I need you to understand. I know how it sounds. I know how stupid I was. I leaned forward slightly. Diane, nothing you tell me in this room will make me think you're stupid. I've spent 2 decades studying how these patterns work. What happened to you follows a very specific, very deliberate strategy that has victimized thousands of intelligent people. You were not stupid, you were targeted. Something in her face shifted. It wasn't quite relief, but it was close. Permission, perhaps. He said we had a connection. She whispered, a spiritual bond. He said he had never felt this with another patient, that what we had was different, sacred. I understood immediately what she was telling me. It started with him touching my face during sessions, she continued. Just gentle, my cheek, my hair. He said he was transferring healing energy, that his touch would accelerate my recovery. Her hands were shaking now. Then my shoulders, my back. He said the cancer was related to blocked energy in my chest, and he needed to release it. She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Gabriel had initiated a sexual relationship with Diane. He framed it as part of the healing process, something he called energy exchange or sacred intimacy. He told her this was a gift he didn't offer to just anyone, that their connection was unique, special, destined. Diane, starving for intimacy after 8 years alone, grieving and terrified and desperate for any form of salvation, accepted this narrative. More than accepted it, she welcomed it. She thought she had found love. She thought that in the middle of her cancer battle, she had somehow been given a second chance at connection. I thought I was his partner, she said. Her voice cracked like dry wood. I thought we were building something. The air in the room felt heavier. What happened? I asked softly, but even as I said it, I already suspected. The progression of touch, the framing of intimacy as healing. I had seen this pattern before in cases of spiritual abuse. Gabriel had laid the groundwork for something darker. Diane's face crumpled. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't continue. Her body seemed to fold into itself, shoulders rounding, chin dropping. Then she took a breath that seemed to pull from somewhere deep and painful. I showed up early one day. To surprise him, I brought flowers. She laughed and the sound was jagged. Flowers, like a teenager. I was 50 years old bringing flowers to a man who was robbing me, and I felt like I was doing something romantic, like we were finally going to be real. She took another breath. I walked into the treatment room. The door wasn't fully closed, and he was there, with another woman, another patient. Her hands were gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly I could see the tendons standing out. He was doing the same energy exchange he did with me, the same words, the same touches, the same voice he used when he told me I was special. In that moment, Diane's world collapsed for the second time. The first had been Robert's death. This was different. This was the death of a reality she had constructed, a story she had told herself to survive. She wasn't special. She wasn't loved. She wasn't healing. She was one of many, a target, a revenue stream, a body in a rotation. Diane didn't confront him. She couldn't speak. Her legs moved without her permission, carrying her out of the building into her car. She drove for 3 hours without knowing where she was going, the highway blurring through tears she didn't remember crying. She ended up at a hospital emergency room, not because she intended to. Her body took over. The coughing had gotten worse. She could barely breathe. The ER doctor examined her and immediately called oncology. When the oncologist saw her scans, his face changed. I know that change. I've seen it in colleagues who have to deliver devastating news. The controlled alarm. The careful neutrality that isn't quite neutral enough. The cancer had spread. It was no longer stage 2, it was stage 3. Aggressive, advancing through tissue while Gabriel fed her turmeric capsules and lies. But here was the cruel miracle. It was still treatable. If she had waited another few months, it might not have been. But in this moment, aggressive intervention could still save her life. Diane started real chemotherapy that week, the kind that made her vomit for hours, the kind that stripped every hair from her body, every eyebrow, every eyelash, the kind that Gabriel had told her would kill her. It saved her instead. As Diane recounted this part of her story, something visible shifted. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her posture had changed. There was a straightness in her spine that hadn't been there when she walked in. Telling this story was costing her something, but it was also giving her something back. Voice, perhaps, or agency. The treatment worked, she said. 6 months of hell, but it worked. The cancer is in remission now. My oncologist says the prognosis is good. That's remarkable, I said. Your body fought hard. My body fought hard despite me, she corrected. I almost killed myself because I trusted a stranger over my own doctors, because I wanted so badly for someone to love me that I ignored every warning sign. I made a careful note of her language. Almost killed myself. No, he almost killed me. Diane was still taking full responsibility for Gabriel's actions. This is a pattern I see often in victims of manipulation. The shame turns inward, becomes self-blame, even when the manipulation was systematic, unprofessional. Diane, I said, I want to reflect something back to you. You described yourself as someone who trusted a stranger over your doctors. But I'm hearing a different story. I'm hearing about a woman who was widowed, alone, terrified by a cancer diagnosis, and specifically targeted by a predator who knew exactly how to exploit her fear and loneliness. You didn't fail. You were failed by a system that allows people like Gabriel to operate, by a healthcare environment so rushed that you never felt heard, by a culture that leaves grieving widows invisible until predators find them. Her eyes filled with tears. She didn't blink. She let them fall. Then why do I still think about him, she asked. Why do I still? She stopped, as if the next words were too shameful to speak. Still feel something? I suggested. She nodded miserably. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of psychological manipulation. The bond doesn't simply disappear when the abuse is revealed. Trauma and attachment become intertwined, creating a confusing emotional landscape where hatred and longing exist in the same breath. Gabriel had deliberately activated Diane's attachment system, the same neural pathways that bond us to parents, to partners, to children. These pathways don't respond to logic. They respond to proximity, to touch, to the feeling of being cared for. It didn't matter that Gabriel's care was performed rather than genuine. Diane's brain had recorded it as real. What you're experiencing is completely normal, I told her. The attachment you feel isn't a sign of weakness or foolishness. It's a biological response that Gabriel deliberately triggered and exploited. Understanding this is the first step to untangling it. We're not going to judge these feelings, we're going to understand them. Diane was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, harder, clearer. There were others. I waited. After I found out about the woman in the treatment room, I started looking. Searching online, I found a support group for people who had been scammed by alternative health practitioners, and I found... She took a shaky breath. I found 6 other women. 6. All with the same story. Some with cancer, some with MS, one with lupus. All desperate. All convinced Gabriel was special. All financially drained. All involved with him. I felt the weight of what she was describing. Gabriel wasn't just a con artist, he was running an operation, a systematic exploitation of dying women, repeated and refined over years. One of them died, Diane said quietly. A woman named Susan. She was 53, a librarian in Ohio, stage 1 breast cancer. Stage 1, do you know what that means? It means she had a 98% survival rate, 98%. She could have walked into a hospital, had a lumpectomy, maybe some radiation, and gone back to her life. But Gabriel found her, the same way he found me. The same emails, the same promises, the same lies. Her voice had dropped to barely a whisper. She never went back to her oncologist, not once after she met Gabriel. She trusted him until the very end. Her daughter found her in bed, surrounded by his herbal capsules. The bottles were still lined up on her nightstand like soldiers. She had taken them that morning, even though she could barely swallow, even though she was dying, because Gabriel told her they would save her. The words hung in the air. I gave them space to breathe. Susan was supposed to retire next year. She had plans. She wanted to travel to Italy and see the libraries there. The Vatican Library, the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice. She had pictures on her wall. Her daughter told me that. Diane's voice cracked. She never made it to Italy. She died in her bedroom in Columbus, Ohio, believing that turmeric and positive thinking would cure what a simple surgery could have fixed. The weight of her words settled between us. Diane's breathing shifted, slower now, deeper. Something had changed in her since she started talking about the other women. The shame was still there, but it was no longer alone. There was something else rising alongside it. Something that looked like purpose. You found these women, I said. You reached out to them. Diane nodded. We talk every week now. Some of them are still in treatment for their illnesses as 5. Some are in remission like me. One of us is dying. The cancer caught too late. The damage too extensive. Her voice caught. We're trying to figure out what to do. What do you want to do? I asked. For the first time since she walked into my office, Diane sat up completely straight. Her chin lifted, her shoulders squared. I saw a flash of the woman she must have been before. The teacher who commanded a classroom, who made poetry feel necessary, who had a voice that carried. I want to stop him, she said. I want to report him. I want to sue him. I want to make sure he never does this to another woman, never takes another dollar, never touches another patient, never buries another Susan. This was significant. Diane was moving from victim to advocate, a transition that often marks the beginning of genuine healing. When we shift our focus from our own shame to the protection of others, something in us fundamentally changes. The wound doesn't disappear, but it starts to serve a purpose. But I also saw the fear behind her words. What's holding you back? I asked. Her jaw tightened. He threatened me. When I finally confronted him, when I told him I knew what he was doing, he said if I went public, he would tell everyone about our relationship. He would say I pursued him, that I was a lonely widow who seduced him, and then got angry when he didn't want to commit. He would make it look like I was a scorned lover, making up lies for revenge. Her hands trembled again. And part of me is afraid people will believe him. Part of me is afraid that when they hear we were together, they'll think I was stupid enough to deserve this. I understood the trap Gabriel had created. The very intimacy he had exploited was now a weapon against Diane. If she came forward, she would have to admit publicly to a relationship she was deeply ashamed of. Her credibility would be attacked. Her reputation as a teacher, as a respectable widow, would be questioned. This is how abusers maintain power even after the abuse ends. They create situations where the victim's shame becomes a prison. Speaking up means exposure, and exposure feels like a second violation. Diane, I said slowly, I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it before you answer. She looked at me, waiting. You said you found 6 other women, 6 women who went through what you went through, 6 women who were manipulated, drained, exploited. One of them died, another is dying now. I leaned forward slightly. If one of those women was sitting in this chair right now, telling me the exact story you just told me, if she said Gabriel threatened to expose their relationship if she spoke up, what would you say to her? What would you want her to know? Diane's face changed. It was like watching a window open. I would tell her. She stopped, swallowed, started again. I would tell her that she has nothing to be ashamed of, that she was sick and scared and someone took advantage of her. That the relationship wasn't really a relationship, it was part of the con, part of how he controlled her. And that the only person who should be ashamed is him. I let her words settle in the space between us. And why is it different when it's you? She didn't answer, but something in her eyes told me she was starting to understand. Over the following months, Diane came to see me weekly, sometimes twice weekly when the darkness felt too heavy to carry alone. Our sessions were not easy. There were no clean breakthroughs, no movie moments where everything suddenly made sense. There were days when the shame overwhelmed her, when she cancelled appointments at the last minute because she couldn't bear to speak anymore. There were days when she sat in my office and said nothing for the first 20 minutes, just breathed, just existed in a space where she didn't have to pretend to be okay. There were days when she raged. At Gabriel, at herself, at a medical system that had failed to warn her about predators like him, at a culture that made widows invisible until someone wanted to exploit them. Over the weeks, I witnessed her move through the stages of grief, not for Robert this time, but for the woman she had been before Gabriel, for the trust she had lost, for the version of herself that believed in goodness without questioning it, that death was necessary, but it was also brutal. But slowly, something changed. She began to separate her identity from her choices. Not all at once, that's not how healing works, but in small incremental shifts. She began to understand that vulnerability is not a flaw. It's a human condition that predators deliberately exploit. She began to see that her loneliness, her grief, her fear, these weren't weaknesses that made her deserving of abuse. They were wounds that Gabriel had identified and targeted with surgical precision. The self-blame didn't disappear, probably never will completely, but it loosened its grip. It made room for other emotions, anger, righteousness, even dark humor about the absurdity of paying thousands of dollars for turmeric. The 6 women she had found became 7, then 9, then 12. They formed an informal support network, meeting on video calls across time zones: Ohio, California, Texas, Florida, New York. Different ages, different professions, different cancers. But the same story, the same techniques, the same words Gabriel had used repeated with slight variations like a script he had memorized. They shared resources. They compared notes. They held each other accountable when the shame threatened to pull them back into isolation. When the voice in their head said you deserved it, you were stupid, you should have known. One woman would feel weak and another would remind her, we were targeted, he was practiced. This is not our fault. They called themselves the survivors. The name was not ironic. They had survived Gabriel. Some of them were still surviving their illnesses. One of them, a woman named Patricia, 71 years old, a retired nurse who should have known better and tormented herself daily with that knowledge, was in hospice care. The cancer Gabriel had told her to ignore had spread to her bones, her liver, her lungs. She joined their video calls from her hospital bed, pale and thin but fiercely alive, determined to see him face justice before she died. Patricia became their moral center. If she could fight from her deathbed, the rest of them had no excuse. And then together, they made a decision. They would go public, all of them, no hiding, no shame. Diane was the first to file a formal complaint with the state medical board. The process was bureaucratic, exhausting, re-traumatizing. She had to recount her story to strangers, answer invasive questions, submit documentation of every payment she had made. But she did it. Gabriel, it turned out, had no medical license of any kind. He wasn't a doctor, wasn't a nurse, wasn't a nurse practitioner. He wasn't even a certified nutritionist or a licensed massage therapist. He had no credentials whatsoever. He was a man with a wellness center and a website and a gift for making dying women fall in love with him. His training consisted of a weekend seminar he had attended 15 years ago, led by another unlicensed practitioner who had since been shut down by the FDA. The complaint triggered an investigation. Inspectors visited his wellness center. They documented the herbal capsules, the equipment, the treatment rooms with their soft lighting and ambient music designed to create an atmosphere of trust. They interviewed former employees, 2 young women who had worked as receptionists and quit when they started to suspect what was happening in those back rooms. Other women came forward, women who hadn't been part of the survivors, women who had suffered in silence for years, women who saw the news story and finally felt permission to speak. The 12 became 15, then 18, then 23. The local news picked up the story. A reporter, young, aggressive, genuinely appalled, did a 3-part exposé. She tracked down Susan's daughter, who wept on camera and held up a photograph of her mother at her 50th birthday, smiling, healthy, alive. She could have lived, the daughter said. She should have lived, and that man killed her with lies. Gabriel hired lawyers, expensive ones. He claimed everything was consensual. He claimed the women knew his treatments were complimentary and had chosen to stop conventional medicine on their own. He claimed the relationships were genuine, that he had fallen in love with each of them, that the intimacy was real, that he couldn't help having a big heart. But there were 23 women now, 23 stories that matched, 23 empty bank accounts, Susan's death certificate, Patricia's hospice records, and a paper trail of emails, receipts, and text messages that documented exactly how Gabriel operated. The case is still ongoing. The wheels of justice move slowly, especially when the accused has money for lawyers. But Diane no longer waits for the outcome to define her. The verdict matters, of course it matters, but it's no longer the center of her life. In our final session before she took a break from therapy, Diane sat across from me looking like a different person than the woman who had first walked through my door. Not healed. I don't believe in complete healing from wounds this deep. But transformed, reassembled, still carrying the scars but no longer hiding them. I spent so long being ashamed, she said, ashamed that I was sick, ashamed that I was alone, ashamed that I fell for his lies, ashamed that I loved him, or thought I did. She shook her head slowly. But shame was the prison he put me in, and I don't want to live in that prison anymore. What do you want? I asked. She smiled, really smiled, for the first time in any of our sessions. It changed her entire face. I want other women to know. I want them to hear my story and recognize the warning signs. I want them to know that needing help doesn't make you foolish. That being lonely doesn't mean you deserve exploitation. That falling for a predator's lies doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It means someone did something terribly wrong to you. She leaned forward. And I want Gabriel to know that I'm not afraid of him anymore. He took my money. He almost took my life. He took something I can never fully get back. But he doesn't get to take my voice. Diane still has hard days. Remission is not a guarantee, and every follow-up scan brings anxiety. She still lives in a small apartment, sold having lost her home to pay for Gabriel's worthless treatments. She still sometimes wakes at 3 a.m. heart pounding, remembering his hands on her face, unable to separate the manipulation from the moments that felt like tenderness. But she also has something she didn't have when she walked into my office. A community. 11 other women who understand. A purpose that gets her out of bed on the dark mornings, and a story that she refuses to let Gabriel silence. Some patients come to me broken and leave whole. That's the narrative people want from therapy stories. Clean arcs, clear resolutions, the wound transformed into wisdom. But Diane taught me something different. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't being healed. It's being honest about the wounds that don't fully close. It's speaking anyway. It's choosing connection over isolation, even when every instinct screams to hide. That's what survival really looks like. Not the absence of scars, but the refusal to let them define you. I hope this story helped you look at your own life, your feelings, or the people around you through a different lens. I hope this story helped you understand yourself and others better. I would love to hear something about you in the comments. I would love to get to know you and your story a little better. If you want to share what's going on inside you, you can write to the email address in my profile. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. To be notified about the next real-life story, you can click the bell icon to turn on notifications. Before we end, I want to ask you a few questions. Take a moment to think about them. What did you think about Diane's story? Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they weren't who you thought they were? How did you find your way back to yourself after that betrayal? Do you believe Diane was foolish for falling for Gabriel's lies? Or do you think any of us could be vulnerable in the same way? Given the right circumstances, the right loneliness, the right fear, the right predator appearing at the right moment. If you met Gabriel's other victims, the 12 women who found each other, what would you say to them? And what would you say to Gabriel if you had the chance? Diane lost everything, her savings, her health, her trust in herself, but she gained a community and a voice. Do you think that trade was worth it? What does healing even mean when someone has lost so much? Why do you think some people prey on the sick and dying? What is missing in someone that allows them to look at a frightened cancer patient and see only an opportunity? And finally, if you knew someone who was being pulled toward an alternative healer, someone who seemed to be offering everything the medical system wasn't, what would you say to them? How would you say it? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Your perspective matters. Your voice matters.